Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark. Welcome to the lecture on past passive participles. Woohoo! You may not know it yet, but past passive participles are by far the most challenging form of participles, so it's very exciting to get into them. They're also the most commonly used form of participles, so you do have to know them, even though you might wish that you didn't. The good news is that, as with all participles, they are used mainly in written Russian rather than spoken Russian. That being said, there are several of them that are used very commonly in casual or widespread speech. So you do, in fact, need to learn this, and you do need to learn some of the basic stress rules for past passive participles, which I will go over at the end of this lecture. So fasten your seatbelts, buckle up your helmets, and let's jump in. So what do past passive participles mean? They refer to the recipient of a completed action, and they mean something that was done by someone. So they are always formed from perfective verbs because they refer to the recipient of a completed action. And they can only be formed from transitive verbs because they are passive. So both present and past passive participles can only be formed from transitive verbs. Remember that transitive verbs are the ones that can take a direct object. The past passive participle, like any other participle, matches its noun in gender, case, and number. And if it is turned into a katori clause, katori will be in the accusative, just as with present passive participles. Also, just as with present passive participles, if you have a clause with a past passive participle, the subject of the verb is in the instrumental. So remember that past passive participles are something that is done by someone. And so when we use them, the person who is doing the action, the subject of the verb, is going to be indicated in the instrumental. So how do we form past passive participles? Unlike the other kinds of participles, which only had one or two formations, past passive participles have three different formations. The first one that we'll go over is a ta formation. And this ta formation is for first conjugation verbs that end in its or its in the infinitive, like nalit to pour, zakrit to close, or zabuit to forget. Or if they have an M or an N in the conjugated form, like vzят, in which when we conjugate it, we get yavazmu, there's an M that appears. A number of words that end in zhat that have this meaning of squeezing, pressing, or harvesting. So this is not all zhat verbs, but this is the collection of first conjugation zhat verbs that refer to squeezing or pressing or harvesting. And then all the nyats and chats verbs are in this group. So in this group, these are all first conjugation verbs that have its, nyats, chats, and some zhats verbs. Past passive participles are formed by adding ta plus the adjectival endings to the infinitive stem. Or another way of looking at it is you look at the infinitive, you drop the miachiznak, and you add an adjectival ending. So if we look at some examples, we have vzят, to take, and the past passive participle is vzятly. Начать, to start, and the past passive participle is начатый. Налить, to pour, and the past passive participle is going to be налитый. Or забыть, to forget, the past passive participle is забытый. So now let's talk about the stress of these ta formation past passive participles. Remember I told you that stress is important for past passive participles because they are sometimes used in spoken Russian, and unfortunately that stress is complex with past passive participles. So with the ta formation past passive participles, what do we do? If they are its or eat verbs, the past passive participle will have the same stress as the infinitive, and that stress is probably going to be on the it or the eat. So for instance, zabuit, to forget, becomes zabuiti, forgotten. Zakrit, to close or cover, becomes zakriti, closed or covered. Открыть, to open, becomes открытый, opened or open. Разбить, to break, becomes разбитый, broken. Nalit, to pour, becomes nalitli, poured. These jat verbs that refer to squeezing, pressing, or harvesting. Again, these are not all jat verbs. For example, держать, and we'll see some держать verbs later. But these jat verbs like нажать, to squeeze or press, or выжать, to squeeze out. I'm talking about this group of verbs that refer to squeezing, pressing, or harvesting, and they are also going to have the same stress as the infinitive in the past passive participle. So нажать, to press on, and is often used, for example, to click on something, like нажать. If you are using a computer, it means to press a button, and it also means to click on a link. Or выжать, to wring out or squeeze out. So нажать becomes нажатый, like pressed, clicked on. It's also to pull a trigger. Нажать курок is to pull a trigger. So нажать with this meaning becomes нажатый. Выжать with the meaning of to squeeze out or wring out becomes выжатый. In both cases, the past passive participle has the same stress as the infinitive. Where things get tricky are these нять and чат verbs that have the same stress as the masculine past tense. So занять, to occupy, becomes он занял in the masculine past tense, and the past passive participle is занятый. Начать, to begin, becomes он начал, and then начатый. Принять, to take or accept, becomes принял, and then принятый. The second type of past passive participle are these N formation past passive participles, the ones that have a double N in them. And these are made from first and second conjugation verbs that end in at, if they do not have an M or an N in the conjugated form. So if they are not this chat or нять group of verbs or the жать group of verbs that have the meaning of pressing, squeezing, or harvesting. If they are one of these at verbs that are not in those other groups, and this is a very large group of verbs, they form the past passive participle by adding n plus an adjectival ending to the infinitive stem. And this includes all the ova verbs. So this is actually the largest group of verbs, these verbs that end in at or ovat, and are not part of these chat, нять, or жать groups. So some examples would be написать, to write, becomes написанный, written. Прочитать, to read, becomes прочитанный, read. Задержать, to hold or arrest, becomes задержанный. Организовать, to organize, becomes организованный. Or арестовать, to arrest, becomes арестованный. And note that Russian actually has two words for to arrest now. It has the native word задержать and the borrowed word арестовать. Задержать is probably used a little more, but they are both used. And note that задержать is a жать verb. It ends in жать, but it is not in this group of жать verbs that mean squeezing, pressing, or harvesting, and so it is in the NN group and not the te group. You may have noticed, as I was reading the words out loud, that the stress did something strange, and indeed, the stress tends to shift in verbs from this group. So if the stress is on the at in the infinitive, the stress is going to shift one syllable to the front of the word or one syllable to the left if you're looking at the written word in the past passive participle. So to go over those words we saw again, прочитать, to read, becomes прочитанный. The stress shifts from at to e. Написать becomes написанный. Again, the stress shifts to the front of the verb. Задержать becomes задержанный. Организовать becomes организованный. And арестовать becomes арестованный. If the stress is earlier on in the verb, if it is not on that final at, it remains on the same syllable in the past passive participle, so переделать, to redo, becomes переделанный, redone. Исследовать, to research, becomes исследованный, researched. Last of all, we have past passive participles that are formed by adding yen or yon. And so these are for second conjugation verbs ending in it, Remember, first conjugation verbs ending in "it", like nalit or razbit, are in the te group. But second conjugation verbs ending in "it", like kupit or vlubit, are in this yen or yon group. And then the other group of verbs that is in this group are first conjugation verbs ending in st, sti, sti, or ch. So these sti verbs or the st verbs or velar stem verbs. So verbs in these groups form the past passive participle by adding yen or yon plus an adjectival ending to the stem of the ya form. So the first two forms, the te formation and the nn formation groups, add their endings to the infinitive. But this third group, this yin-yon group, adds the yin-yon to the stem of the ya form. Unless you have a velar stem verb, in which case they will form participles from the ti form of the verb. Remember that velar stem verbs have two different stems, one for the ya and ani forms and another for the other forms. And so with velar stem verbs, you are going to form the past passive participle from the ti stem. But with all the other verbs in this group, you're going to form the past passive participle by adding yen or yon to the ya form. So some examples are kupit, kupliu, kuplinly. Or vlubit, to make someone fall in love with you. Vlubliu becomes vlublionly, which means someone who is in love. Ispiec, to bake. The ispiciosh becomes ispichonly, baked. Privesti, to accompany or guide or spend time, becomes prividu, prividionly. And note the stress. We're going to talk about stress more in the next slide, but note that when the participial marker, this yin-yon suffix, is under stress, it is pronounced yonly. And when it is not under stress, it is yenly. So kuplinly, but vlublionly. So now let's talk a little bit more about stress. Actually, let's talk a lot more about stress for these types of participles. And they have the most complicated stress pattern. So it'll take us a little while. So just, get some popcorn or something and let's start. If these are participles made from first conjugation verbs, the participles will generally take on the same stress as the feminine past tense. So if we look at, for instance, privesti, to accompany, guide, or to spend, like to spend time, она привела, and then it becomes приведенный. So the stress comes sort of on the end there. Привела, приведенный, on the third syllable. Привести with a z, and we'll get more into verbs of motion in the next couple of chapters. But yes, the st, e, and the z, te, e are two different verbs. So привести spelled with a z, but pronounced s there because of automatic devoicing, which means to bring somewhere by vehicle. Она привезла becomes привезенный. Испечь, to bake. Она испекла becomes испеченный. However, постричь, to cut, like to cut someone's hair, becomes постригла and then постриженный. And украсть, to steal. Она украла becomes украденный. So note how it matches the stress of the feminine past tense. Привела, приведенный, привезла, привезенный, испекла, испеченный, постригла, постриженный, украла, украденный. The stem is different, but the stress is the same. The major exception are the et verbs. So, for instance, найти, to find, она нашла, she found, becomes найденный, found, with the stress on the first syllable rather than the second syllable. The same with пройти, to pass or go through or complete. Она прошла, пройденный, passed or completed or gone through. So those are the major exceptions. Then we have the other type of verbs in this group, which are second conjugation verbs ending in "-ite", and many of them, not all of them, but many of them are shifting stress second conjugation verbs. And if we have a shifting stress second conjugation verb in this group, the participle will take the stress of the "ti" form, even though it takes the stem of the "ya" form. So kupit, to buy, becomes "ja kuplu", so we're going to have that "l" stem, but "ti kupish", so we're going to have the stress on the "u", and it becomes kupljenly, bought. Получить, there's no stem change, but it becomes "ja получу", "ti получишь", and then полученly, received or gotten. Полюбить, to start to like or to fall in love with something. Я полюблю, ты полюбишь becomes полюбленный, liked or fallen in love with something. However, there is an important exception, and that is влюбить, to make someone fall in love with you. Я влюблю, ты влюбишь, but the past passive participle is влюбленный, with the stress on that "your" there. And since this is one of the most commonly used past passive participles, you want to remember it. Влюбленный. You're much more likely to use the past passive participle than you are the verb. Another thing about past passive participles that makes them more exciting than other forms of participles is that they are often used in their short form, in the predicate. Remember that the predicate is when something is something and is also in the nominative. And we very often use these past passive participles in their short forms in the predicate. So with te formation past passive participles, we just drop the adjectival endings and we add the appropriate short form ending. So открытый, open or opened, becomes открыт, открыто, открыто, открытый. The n and the yen yon formation groups drop their second n when they become short. So napisanly, written, becomes napisan, napisana, napisana, napisanly. Полученly, received or gotten, becomes получен, получена, получена, полученly. But wait, there's more. You thought that perhaps that was not so bad, but of course there's always stress. In Russian, there's always stress. So what happens with the stress in these short forms of these past passive participles? If it is a yonly form, not a yenly form, but a yonly form, so it has the yon, it has the yo in it, and we make a short form of it, then it will be end stressed. So влюбленный becomes он влюблен, она влюблена, оно влюблено, они влюблены. Проведенный becomes он проведен, она проведена, оно проведено, они проведены. And then the short forms of past passive participles formed from chat or nyat verbs have the same stress as the past tense. So занятый, busy or occupied, becomes он занят, она занята, оно занято, они заняты. Начатый, begun, becomes он начат, она начата, оно начато, они начаты. And then the stress on the short forms of other types of past passive participles is generally going to be the same as the long form. So that's easy, right? Nothing to worry about. The only time you have a shifting stress is when you have these yonly forms and these past passive participles formed from chat and nyat verbs. And finally, let's look at some examples of how to use past passive participles. Your textbook has a lot of good examples and a lot of good readings to do, but let's look at a couple more examples. So as always, past passive participles, like any other participle, match the nouns that they modify in gender, case, and number. And they can either precede the noun, in which case they are not separated from it by a comma, or they can follow the noun, in which case they are separated from it by a comma. So we could say, билеты, купленные мной вчера, is the same as купленные мной вчера билеты. which is the same as билеты, которые я купила вчера. Or basically the same. So the first two, билеты, купленные мной вчера, and купленные мной вчера билеты are tickets bought by me yesterday. And then билеты, которые я купила вчера, are the tickets that I bought yesterday. They all mean basically the same thing. Notice we just have the different constructions and the different comma placements. Also notice that the subject of the verb in the который clause becomes the instrumental in the participial clause. So купленные мной means the same thing as которые я купила. Or another example, книга, написанная великим писателем Львом Толстым, is the same as написанная великим писателем Львом Толстым книга, the book written by the great writer Lev Tolstoy. And that's basically the same as книга, которую написал великий писатель Lev Tolstoy. The book that the great writer Lev Tolstoy wrote. Notice once again this use of the instrumental книга, написанная великим писателем Львом Толстым, is the same as книга, которую написал великий писатель Lev Tolstoy. In the first instance, we have the instrumental Львом Толстым, and in the second, we have the nominative Lev Tolstoy. So there you have it. That is all you need to know about past passive participles, or maybe that's way more than you need to know. In either case, you have plenty of information about past passive participles. As usual, I would recommend that you go through it in small chunks. This is a really big info dump in this lecture. You might want to go through it slide by slide. In any case, I hope you found it helpful and enjoy your Russian.